Welcome. Hi, I'm Robbie Feuerstein, Cowgirl Yarns Knit Doctor. And today's tutorial we're going to be talking about reading your knitting 101. So what does it mean to read your knitting and why is it important? Well, reading your knitting is being able to look at the work that you've created, knowing that you've put the right stitches in the right place, and how to go back and look and see that you actually have made a mistake. So learning how to read your knitting is a very important skill that you develop as you continue to grow in your ability to knit. One of the main advantages to learning how to read your work is you're able to make that connection between your knitted work and the fabric that's growing on your needles. So you'll be able to catch those little problem areas such as a drop stitch, a wrong cable, a yarn over in the wrong place like we've talked about in the last two tutorials that I've taught. And this will allow you to grow in your knowledge and your confidence in your knitting abilities. Those of us that have been knitting for a long time still make mistakes, and the thing that makes us a little bit different is as we have learned how to knit, we've also learned what to look for in our knitting. So hopefully after today's tutorial, you'll feel a little more confident in what you're doing with your knitting, how to find those mistakes, what to do with those mistakes, and we've talked about in the last two tutorials how to go back and fix them. So go ahead and grab your knitting and let's get started.
So let's go ahead and learn a little bit more about reading your knitting. So I have a little swatch here in front of me, and this is what's called stockinette stitch, which means that you have knit one row and purled one row. And I've used this stockinette stitch example so that we can take a little bit closer look at what knitting stitches look like versus purling stitches. So if you look at a knit stitch, it is created by, if I look straight down from my stitch on my needle to this row, I'm going to try and isolate it with my fingers. Okay, there is a series of what I call V's, or some people call chevrons. But if you look, there's a V here, there's a V here, a V here, one here, one here. So there is a series of knit stitches built on top of each other. By knowing what a knit stitch looks like, you are able to actually count your rows that you have knit by looking at the chevron pattern and the loops that are created on the sides as you look up your work, your knitting work. Okay, so let's talk about those rows. You have knit, these are your knit stitches. And if I count each one of these chevrons, I can determine the number of rows that I have knitted. So if I start here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So the knitting stitches, as you look at them, all are a flat looking fabric, okay, in your stockinette stitch. If I turn it over and I look at the side that has the purl bumps on it, the reason I say purl bumps is if you look, each one of these purl stitches has a little hump on it or a bump. Okay, and so if you take one stitch on your needle and you follow those purl bumps down, you can determine that this is one stitch, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, those are the number of rows that you have beneath your stitch on your needle. So those are the difference between the purl stitch and the knit stitch. Now, on one side of your fabric, you'll notice that what is a knit stitch on one side is a purl on the other. They're actually the front and the back of the same stitch, or if you want to think about your face of your knitting and the reverse of your knitting, the face would be the knit stitch and the reverse would be the purl stitch. So knitting is made up of two basic stitches, the knit stitch and the purl stitch. And all other stitches are a combination of or an altering of those two stitches. So if you look at your knitting, each one of these stitches is built on the stitch below it. So when you are knitting across, you are building on the row of stitches below it. So it's kind of like if you want to think about it as a grid. And in a future tutorial, I will talk a little bit more about reading a grid or reading a pattern that is from a chart. But each one of these stitches is actually like a grid. So you would have a grid across, or a grid up and down, and a grid across. So when you are doing your knitting and you realize that something looks slightly odd, and we've talked about this in my previous 2 videos on fixing mistakes, but I have a couple of pieces of knitting that I have, and I want you to take a look at one of them where I have made a mistake and I have not gone back to fix it because I'm kind of using it as a tutorial or a training piece. So I'm going to get this piece of knitting out that I have, and I want you to take a look at it and see if you can look at this knitting and you're actually reading it, looking at it to see that what I did was, instead of doing a knit row all the way across this side, I've actually created a bunch of purl stitches. So in a sense, I've made a mistake. But knowing that I knitted this before I really became skilled in reading my knitting, and I did not notice that I had made the mistake. Now it bothers me now that I look at it because I can go back and fix it. But in a sense, I've learned that knowing that this particular mistake, if I had learned to read my knitting and look back at what I had done, I would have noticed that before I had finished the project. The next thing I'm going to have you look at is what's the difference when we've talked about stockinette stitch, and in a previous video we talked about garter stitch where you knit every row. But let's look at some ribbing. And so I have a sweater here that has some ribbing on it, and I'm going to try and lay it out here so you can get a good look at the ribbing on it. And this ribbing is actually created by knit 2 stitches and purl 2 stitches. So if you look, you can see that there's 1 row of stitches here and 1 row of stitches here. That is 2 knit stitches. And if I pull it apart, you can see a bump here and a bump here. Those are 2 purl stitches. So knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2. So that's one more thing about reading your knitting, is knowing that on that face side of your fabric, the side that you're looking at, that your knit stitches look like knit stitches and your purl stitches look like purl stitches, and not mixed up in between each other. And that, of course, would be a mistake, and you would want to go back and fix that. We've talked about going back and fixing those mistakes in our previous tutorials. And so hopefully knowing now that what they look like, how they look in rows, and how they look in columns, so rows and columns, will help you determine if you've made a mistake and what you need to do to go back and fix them. Hopefully, learning how to read your knitting will give you the confidence and the skill that you need to grow in your knitting and in those skills that you want to develop. So I hope you've enjoyed today's lesson on how to read your knitting. We all know that we are developing our skills as knitters, and nobody's perfect. We're all human and we all make mistakes. So rather than panicking and putting it in the closet like we've talked before, I hope that learning to read your knitting, learning how to fix those simple mistakes has helped you gain confidence as a knitter. We all know that those problems arise, and now knowing that you can solve them will hopefully help you create those beautiful art projects and not put them in the back of a closet. If you have a problem that you need me to look at or help you fix, I am at Cowgirl Yarn on Thursday afternoons from 4:30 until 6. And so call the shop, make an appointment with me, and we'll see if we can't get you back to where you are in your project. If you have other ideas for videos, tutorials that you would like me to help you with or create, I would be glad to do that. Just leave a message in the comment line for this video, and we'll see what we can do to help you out with your needs. Hope you have a good day and look forward to seeing you in the future.